Okay, so as Paul said in the introduction, I'm just going to talk a bit more about some of the research we've been doing in Newcastle, and then specifically on the Learning and Action Alliance. So just to begin, a lot of this research is based on the Urban Flood Resilience Project that began in 2016 and will run until mid next year. It's funded by the Engineering and Physical Science Research Council, but it's not just an engineering project, and this will come out through the rest of the webinar. There's lots of different strands to this research, as we all know that achieving flood resilience and managing flood risk is not just about getting the engineering right. It's about designing assets that people support and are aware of, and ultimately help improve quality of life, as well as managing water and those key objectives there. So the aim of the Urban Flood Resilience Project was to try and figure out how to make flood resilience achievable in practice and at a national scale, and looking at transformative changes needed in the way that we manage flood risk. So a lot of this is thinking about moving from the traditional grey infrastructure approach, where we remove water as quickly as we can from the surface and put it underground, or we build big walls and barriers to keep water out. And looking more at how we can work with water through using it on the surface in blue and green infrastructure, and trying to get some of the other benefits from that type of approach to the environment and society. Looking at water as a whole system, so trying to look at how we can manage flood risk and drought, for example. Looking at wastewater components as well, and how we basically how rainfall moves from the clouds and towards the sea, and the whole of that urban water cycle. So we define urban flood resilience as a city's capacity to maintain future flood risk at acceptable levels by preventing deaths and injuries, minimising damage and disruption during floods, allowing us to recover quickly after a flood, and ensuring social equity in flood management, while at the same time protecting the city's cultural identity and economic vitality. So it's not an easy task, and some of the work we've done is looked at small components of how we can go about making this change and what needs to be done in terms of additional research. So the research consortium consists of 9 universities based around the UK, and we've got 2 case study cities. So Newcastle is more of our retrofit case study, and the Ebbsfleet Garden City down in Kent is our new build case study. The project's been supported by the funders, the EPSRC, and our strategic advisory board, which includes a range of different public and private organisations that have helped us, I guess, keep our research on track and try and deliver academic outputs and outputs that will be useful for practitioners. So the 3 themes of the Flood Resilience Project, the first one focuses on engineering design and how blue and green and grey treatment trains can be integrated to provide flood risk management functions and support resilient management of water quantity and water quality. So a lot of this work is being done in Newcastle by colleagues at Newcastle University and their flood modelling software, and others, for example, in Heriot-Watt, who are looking at this sediment transport through suds ponds and the kind of biodiversity and ecosystem services benefits of sud systems. The second aim looks at developing flood and water management assets that function interoperably. And interoperability is a relatively new concept, but it's about designing the water system to deliver benefits to other systems and vice versa. So looking at how water and transport can be mutually designed to benefit both those aspects. The final theme is looking at planning and more of the social side. So looking at how urban flood risk management could be put at the heart of urban planning, and looking at how there can be a better interface between planners, developers, engineers, and communities who are in receipt of blue-green infrastructure and SUDs, and who are the primary beneficiaries. And this is where the Learning and Action Alliance component comes in. So this is just a diagram showing the 5 work packages under the different research themes. So we've done quite a bit of work on managing stormwater as a resource. There's more information on our website, so go and have a look if you're interested. And this looks at the potential for rainwater harvesting and designing rainwater harvesting systems to manage flood risk and store water for potential use in times of drought. We've done the work with interoperability that's being led by colleagues at Leeds. Work package 4, looking at citizens' interactions with blue and green assets, which I've been doing some work with colleagues at the University of the West of England on this, and we've done some developed some new tests to look at perceptions of blue-green infrastructure and SUDs and the explicit and implicit perceptions and how these are different. So what I'm going to talk about today is work package 5, which is where we try and look at how we can achieve flood resilience in practice using our case study cities. So the Newcastle upon Tyne case study is focusing on innovative flood risk management and how blue, green and grey infrastructure can be combined. So the Newcastle LAA was actually established in February 2014 under the Blue Green Cities project, and we've continued from that date with a lot of support from the LAA members that I'll introduce shortly. So the aim of the Blue Green Cities project and a lot of the early thinking within the Learning and Action Alliance was around recreating natural water cycles within city environments. And the idea as part of this component of the research was to look at how competent authorities and businesses can be put at the centre of the research. And the way we did that was to try and organise this group that allowed the research to be disseminated and shared with practitioners and then get practitioner feedback to try and make sure that our research had a useful outcome and it wasn't just going to be put in a book on a shelf somewhere. And it also helps share knowledge, and a lot of it is about the co-production of knowledge and negotiation and conflict resolution, which I'll talk about next. So just as an aside, a blue-green city is one of the objectives of the Newcastle Learning Action Alliance, and this is where we recreate a natural water cycle in an urban environment, and doing this by bringing green infrastructure and planning together and to try and deliver those multiple benefits of blue-green infrastructure. So Learning and Action Alliances can help overcome a lot of the barriers to the implementation of blue-green infrastructure, and some other work that we've done has looked at what those barriers are based on interviews with a range of different professionals in Newcastle and overseas. And we've split these barriers into 3 different types. So biophysical barriers, which is things like engineering uncertainty, how we do retrofit, things like climate change, how you downscale projections, what type of maintenance is needed to maintain functionality. And we found that the biophysical barriers aren't the big ones. The more difficult barriers to overcome are those that fall into the socio-political and governance categories. So things like the culture of designing flood risk management infrastructure, the fact that grey is a tried and tested approach, and for some people that's the fallback option, and blue-green, even though it's been around for several decades, is still perceived as a novelty in many circles. Governance issues around partnerships, collaboration, leadership, who will champion these solutions, and then more concrete things like legislation, standards, regulations, or the lack of these things are all barriers to the implementation of more blue and green infrastructure. So the specific ones that link to the Learning and Action Alliance are the ones that I've highlighted here. So it is more of the governance, socio-political factors around communication and awareness raising, interagency working. And we found that the Learning and Action Alliance has helped overcome some of these barriers in Newcastle and reduce some of the others. So a Learning and Action Alliance is quite an informal arrangement where participants create a joint understanding of a problem and its possible solutions based on a lot of discussion and criticism, positive criticism of different ideas. So the idea is that people who are interested in a topic, so for Newcastle it was flood resilience and blue and green infrastructure, come along to meetings that happen. Well, I think in Newcastle it's been roughly quarterly or slightly less. And we discuss basically how we can overcome some of these challenges and what kind of innovative solutions could be possible. And the idea is that we don't just talk about what we normally talk about in these kind of meetings and what our typical institutional standpoint is. It's more about looking outside of the box and thinking of some novel solutions, just ignoring the fact that these have to be paid for and funded, just thinking what would be the best thing to do to solve this problem, and then trying to use that learning and take it back into our everyday working lives to then see if some components of those ideas can be incorporated into actual plans and things that will be implemented on the ground. So it's, as Paul mentioned earlier, it's about discussing wicked problems and finding solutions to wicked problems. So wicked problems are normally defined as problems that can't be solved by science alone or by traditional top-down governance alone, and are bound by the remit of individual stakeholders and organisations. So it's basically problems that require a lot more discussion and maybe a bottom-up approach from a governance perspective that maybe can't be solved within existing formal institutional settings and require a wider range of people to come together to discuss. And then the ideas that are mentioned and discussed and debated at Learning and Action Alliance meetings are then taken back into these organisations and used in some of the decision-making processes. And Darren and Stina will talk more about that later. There isn't really a fixed structure. There's a framework that we followed by Richard Ashley and others, and there's been quite a few Learning Action Alliances before the Newcastle one, lots of them in Europe as part of some European research projects. So we didn't invent this process, we just invented the Newcastle version. The framework usually goes through 5 phases, from initiation, scoping and context, basically figuring out what the key challenges are and how the LAA is going to run, developing a shared vision, which is really important and is what binds the LAA together and helps focus the different meetings, especially if the LAA is going to last for quite a while. And it's important that vision evolves over the lifetime of the process. And it's really useful to have a strong leader or champion. And over the last 5 years in LAA, we've had several leaders or champions that have really helped get others involved in the LAA and lead to some action and impact from the discussions that we've had in these meetings. And the overarching aim really is to break down barriers to information sharing, whether they're horizontal barriers across different departments within an organisation, or vertical barriers, so within different levels in that organisation and between different organisations. So in Newcastle, what we found that was really useful was having a catalyst to drive the Learning Action Alliance and bring people together. And in Newcastle, this was the 2012 flood or Toon monsoon. And we actually started the Blue Green Cities project in 2013. And because there had been this flood event in Newcastle, that's why we chose Newcastle as our case study city. So just briefly, 50 millimetres of rain fell in 2 hours. It was classified as a 1 in 100-year event. Over 1,200 properties were affected and over 500 homes flooded internally. And so this led to a lot of interest in flooding and managing flood risk in Newcastle City Council. And some of the work that we've done with them has been used in some of those future plans. But it really helped bring people together because there was this common purpose. So at the moment, we're looking at setting up a Learning Action Alliance in Nottingham, and we haven't had a big flood event like this, thankfully. And the different stakeholders involved have all got different ideas of the challenges, which is making it quite difficult to have that catalyst and central objective. So in terms of creating new Learning Action Alliances, I'd say a catalyst to bring everyone together is really important. So the Newcastle LAA membership, they're typically founded around an organising group. So that's just someone who coordinates meetings and tries to bring people together and involves other members as the process continues. And in our project and in the LAA in Ebbsfleet, this was the research projects who did this, partly because it was part of our research. We were using some of the work from the LAA in academic papers, etc., and because we therefore had the time and the resources to organise these meetings. Around that is a core group which is the people who attend the regular face-to-face meetings and, share some of the work that they're doing and help raise awareness of blue-green infrastructure and the LAA amongst their organisation. And so groups involved in this was the City Council, Northumbrian Water, the Environment Agency, and then different consultants, not-for-profits, and of course Newcastle University, because we were on their patch, and they were really great in setting up the LAA and helping us continue with it. And around the outside is a wider group. So these are people who are interested in the overall objective of the LAA, but maybe can't attend every single meeting, but come to different themed meetings which are relevant to them. So it's having this I guess 3-tier of membership allows for a lot more flexibility. So people who want to be involved, maybe just by learning about outputs through emails, etc., but can't commit to every single meeting, they still know what's happening in the group. And what we found is it's really important to include groups that are not typically part of those flood risk management discussions. So to look at who else might be impacted by flood schemes, or who else has a stake in managing flood risk in different parts of the city, and trying to bring those groups together. And at the start we did a big stakeholder mapping exercise to figure out who those groups were and how we could get them involved. So the Newcastle LAA vision is for Newcastle to become a city that follows the principles of a blue-green city by maximising the opportunities to achieve multiple benefits of blue-green approaches to surface water management. And in the first few months of the LAA, we set up this vision, and it was negotiated, and we looked at it again when we started the Urban Flood Resilience Project to make sure that the vision was still suitable, and it has, some of the wording's been changed slightly over time. And then the role of the LAA is to promote the vision and realise it by recognising windows of opportunity and using those windows of opportunity to influence the strategies of decision makers. So within our LAA, it wasn't aimed at some of the, the very high level of decision makers, but it involved people who could therefore influence them. And that was the way that we tried to create impact and change. And what's in it for you as a member? This, I found, was delivered by Kit England, who was at Newcastle City Council when we started the LAA, and he gave this at our very first LAA meeting in February 2014. And this was his idea of what the research project and the LAA will help us to understand. And so there is acknowledgement of how the LAA is useful and what the project can deliver. And a lot of it is giving practitioners access to really new research, getting you to influence that research and make sure it's useful for what you need it for later on. And then obviously the specific bits that are related to the actual research project. So I think in Newcastle, something that Kit was interested in was looking at how different finance models could be used and monetizing some of the different benefits. So the activities that have happened over the course of the LAA have been quite varied. We've done lots of different mapping exercises where we've looked at some of the existing blue-green infrastructure and SUDs, some of the planned projects, and some visionary projects. So, an idea where it would be great to have SUDs over here that did X, Y, and Z. And those things, even though it's not part of anybody's plan, is always in the back of your mind. And I think, at some point could potentially be a future project after more discussion with the group. And we've had several different conferences. We've done a few walking tours of the city, looking at planned areas for redevelopment. We've done workshops with other groups, so the Nativation Project, which some of you might know about, we've done a workshop with them. And we've had 2 big conferences where we've launched the Newcastle Declaration on Blue and Green Infrastructure, and Darren or Stina will talk about that a bit later. But just to say that originally in 2016 we had 6 signatories sign it, and then that's increased to 10 when we relaunched the declaration in March this year. And it basically commits people to better collaboration and partnership and using all those ideas from the LAA in trying to deliver more blue and green in Newcastle. The LAA is also a good link between research and practice and policy. So some of the stuff we did looked at where we could put blue and green infrastructure in the urban core. And this example shows Northumberland Street and John Dobson Street. And some of the ideas from our like master planning meeting were then incorporated into some of the flood modelling and work that we were doing, looking at multiple benefit analysis. So just a hypothetical example, if you put green roofs on some of these buildings and put street trees in and permeable paving, this would be a map of some of the different benefits, and basically the darker the green, the stronger the benefit. And it just shows that the benefits do spread much further than the site of implementation. And there's a lot more research into the multiple benefits toolkit that you can find out about on our website. But the LAA was really useful in finding those case study areas and making the solutions that we put in the model as realistic as possible. And this is just a framework to show how the blue-green vision from the LAA can be negotiated and actioned. So as I said before, we start with a catalyst based on different local catchment issues. The LAA comes in, and then there's a range of different processes that have happened over several years in Newcastle, beginning with stakeholder identification and looking at opportunities for intervention, things like quick wins, developing the vision, and then ultimately evidence and uptake into practice and policy. And throughout all of this, there's engagement with the LAA members and recruitment of other members. So the membership is quite fluid. So just a quick slide on some of the benefits of joining an LAA. It's a great place for networking, so opening and broadening communication channels and strengthening existing relationships that you already have, but maybe you don't have time to meet and discuss some of these, and this is a good way of bringing people together. The co-production of knowledge and learning. So there is a big focus on learning about other people and departments and organizations' way of working and their approach to blue-green. And sometimes this is outside of your normal professional remit, but there is a way of talking about this to try and identify some objectives that are shared amongst maybe disparate groups that can be worked on to realize some common goals and objectives, and potentially help identify where there could be options for joint funding. It can also help speed up data sharing between partners, and then again there's the link with the academic research and the access to the research and the ability to influence the direction of that research. In terms of keeping the LAA running and sustaining it, this is just some things that we've thought about for the Newcastle LAA. So to begin, it's important to have a catalyst, and maybe changing that over the course of the LAA depending on what happens in that city and what some of the other objectives of the key organisations are. Having a vision, but allowing it to evolve, and having people who really champion this vision and try and get it implemented in their organisations. Having a group that's got a good rapport and has a sense of trust, which means that people can openly communicate and share things that maybe they wouldn't share in an environment that they weren't so trusting of. And being clear about why people should get involved in the LAA and managing expectations. So the process is quite long. Change isn't going to happen immediately. Academic research doesn't happen immediately and often happens a lot slower than you'd like in the practitioner world. So just being clear of how the process will happen, and then including a broader range of stakeholders that can identify with some of those other benefits of blue-green infrastructure. Flexibility, evolution, continued engagement, and this is really from the coordinator to keep organising meetings that are interesting and will involve a different range of stakeholders, and managing different conflicts. And as I said, for us, it was a project researcher who had the resources to do this. And I don't know how difficult this would be for other stakeholders. And this is something that we need to think about in Newcastle when the flood resilience project finishes next year. So that's the end. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you, Emily. There haven't been any questions, and I'm conscious of time, so maybe I'll just ask one question, if I may. I mean, we keep on hearing quite a lot of reference to community engagement and partnership working. Could you explain how the Learning Action Alliance differs from other types of collaboration, please?
Yeah, I think one thing to just point out with the LAA is that it didn't really involve any members of the community per se. It was more of a professional group, but people who joined did live in Newcastle, so were also community members, and that was just a decision of the group. And there are reasons for that. And LAAs can, or they don't have to include members of the community. But how this differs from other groups, I think it's more about the informality and just the way that we have the different discussions and the way that things are talked about. There's no minutes taken. Everything is kind of off the record, and so I think it creates the informal environment that allows people to speak freely and maybe leads to more innovative thinking than it maybe in some other groups and ways of collaborating. That's what I'd say. Ask Darren and Stina the same and see if they have the same idea.
Okay, I will do, and that brings us nicely on to Darren, so thank you for that, Andy.